Hello, welcome to Infofire, the Fireside chat series from Information Matters. Each episode is a conversation on a chosen topic between an expert and a host. I am Shalini R, your host for this series. I have had the privilege of interacting with scholars across disciplines and around the world at meetings and conferences that I attended or organized on a variety of topics, including digital libraries, iSchools, ICT for development, and others. Believing in the power of digital technologies to transform science and scholarship, I initiated many projects. Vidyanidhi Digital Library and e-scholarship portal funded by the Government of India as a pilot study and then by the Foundation to expand into a national initiative is one of them. In this episode of Infofire, I will be in conversation with Dr. Daniel Atkins, Emeritus W.K. Kellogg Professor of Information and Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Professor Atkins was instrumental in transforming Michigan School of Information and Library Studies into an iSchool under a Kellogg-funded initiative called Coalition on Reinventing Information Science, Technology and Library Education. Dan Atkins gathered leading educators and thinkers from the library and the broader information world to strategize the transformation of School of Information and Library Studies into something broader, leading to the establishment of the School of Information in 1996 and became the founding dean of the School of Information. He was instrumental in getting the W.K. Kellogg Foundation to invest more than $15 million in the new iSchool and the information movement in general. Dr. Atkins was a leading force in strengthening the iSchool movement. He pioneered interdisciplinary research on cyber-enabled distributed knowledge communities, including collaboratories and digital libraries applied to scientific research and education. He chaired the Blue Ribbon Panel on Research Cyber Infrastructure for the NSF that became an international roadmap for initiatives on cyber-enabled research in the digital age. He was the inaugural director of the Office of Cyber Infrastructure at the National Science Foundation. He served as Dean of Engineering and Associate VP for Research at University of Michigan. He has chaired or served on many advisory boards for government, academia, philanthropy, and industry. Recently, he served as the chair for a multi-academy committee from the National Academies of Engineering, Science, and Medicine to report on current efforts to develop advanced and automated workflows for scientific research. In this episode of Infofire, on the topic of evolution of computing infrastructure for research, is AI the future of research? We will be touching upon a variety of topics, including some of the outcomes and deliberations of this multi-academic committee from the National Academies of Engineering, Science and Medicine on the automated workflows for scientific research. Hi Dan, welcome to Infofire, the Fireside chat series from Information Matters. We are privileged, indeed honored to have you with us today in this episode of Infofire, taking us through the journey of how the computing infrastructure is impacting the way we do research. To say that computers have changed our way of life is perhaps an understatement. It has dramatically changed everything that we do, including scientific research. So you pioneered interdisciplinary research in cyber-enabled infrastructure development, building with digital library communities for scientific and engineering research, and such, and also education. You chaired the National Academy's Blue Ribbon Panel Advisory Commission, which helped shape actually cyber-enabled scientific and engineering research. And later, you became the inaugural director of the Office of Cyber Infrastructure of the National Science Foundation. So in these positions, you led the efforts to provide an international roadmap for initiatives for building cyber infrastructure for scientific research. In a sense, I would like to say that you have not only had the front row seat, but the driver's seat of developing these initiatives and help shaping the cyber-enabled infrastructure for scientific research and the impact that it has had so far. So please tell our viewers how your personal journey as a researcher in computing or computation, or you can say computer architecture, to a leader in this field. What has been your journey? Share your story with our viewers to begin with.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to reconnect with you, and thank you for this opportunity. Yes, I indeed have had the really unique privilege of kind of living through this incredible revolution that we have had. I entered undergraduate at Bucknell University in 1961, and we had a progressive professor there who had acquired an IBM 1620, a very early serial type computer. And it didn't take me long to figure out that if I went into computing, I would never have to decide what I wanted to do with my life because it had such broad application. So I got a degree in electrical engineering because computer science was not available. But then I went on to graduate school at the University of Illinois, which was a hotbed of computer construction. And of course, a major research project in those days was simply to design and build a computer that would operate reliably enough and long enough to be useful. So before I went to graduate school, of course, the computers had been built with vacuum tubes. And then I participated in ILLIAC 2 at Illinois, which was one of the first solid state computers, but with discrete transistors and in the size of half of a football field. So initially, of course, computers were programmed calculators to do repetitive scientific calculations, the ENIAC being a prime example, supported by the military to compute tables for artillery shells. But then as the computers became more reliable and particularly became transistorized, we went to the computer center model, where a multi-million-dollar computer would be purchased by a institution such as a university. And initially it was used in a batch mode where people would prepare punched cards and take them to the center physically, hoping not to drop them and get them unsorted. And then sometime later come back and pick up printout of the results. But the batch mode was fairly short-lived because we had the emergence of time sharing, which was an operating system that gave the illusion that everyone had this computer at their personal use, but it was done in a round-robin fashion. But the input was still very primitive on a teletype or keyboard type device. The screen was totally alphanumeric, and you also generally had to go pick up your results at the computing center, and still, if for big programs, take the cards there. So that era was actually led at the University of Michigan, where we invented something called Michigan Terminal System, which was one of the earliest time-sharing systems. But of course, as the advances in integrated circuits, small scale, medium scale, and ultimately large scale integrated circuits, both the cost and the performance of computing proceeded to go, the cost went down and the performance went up at an exponential rate, as predicted by the famous Moore's curve. And that then created the economic potential for building smaller computers and less expensive computers. And so we had an era of many computers, which could be purchased by a department and used locally for time sharing and so forth. And we then, of course, with Apple II and Commodore and others, we started entering the era of the personal computer as a standalone computing device that you could use as you will. And and it's also important to note that the software to enable people to program computing also improved along the way. When I started in computing, you programmed in assembly language, one-on-one with the basic instruction set of the computer. But when we got the higher level compilers such as Fortran, Algol, and so forth, particularly Fortran for scientific and engineering computing became widespread, and more and more people were able to use it in their particular endeavor in science. And it took off, it started having profound impact on the nature of what people did in science and engineering. Then, as the cost of VLSI went down, the performance went up, it became feasible to put more and more power into the terminal, the device that you used on your desktop, and finally enough power that you could start using that power to build a much more user-friendly graphic-based, what you see is what you get type interface. And that allowed much more visual interaction with scientific and engineering for both analysis and design. So we had the big central computers and we had the personal computers, and initially they weren't connected to each other, except perhaps the personal computer was used as a terminal emulator. But as networking evolved, the two started being brought together in an integrated fashion. And so starting in the early 80s, we had the emergence of the engineering workstation, the Sun, the Apollo, and so forth, which had substantial compute power in the box that could sit on your desk, both for visualization and for computation. So these were essentially your personal mainframe computer. They had the compute power of older computers of just a few generations past. And we started learning how to network those together and network them together with shared data servers. And so that was the emergence of the distributed computing environment. Now, there was a period of time when there were many competing protocols for networks, both local and wide area. Local area networking, fortunately, tended to standardize on the Ethernet protocols. But long distance, wide area networking, there were many competing factions from different vendors hoping to propagate their proprietary network. ARPA, our Defense Research Agency, was sponsoring work on networks that would be robust, ways that you could automatically reconfigure networks if part of it went down in a military network. And that was based on this notion of packet networks. So that was the origin of what we now know as the TCP/IP protocols that are standard for the internet. But so there was an experiments run between 4 or 5 major research universities using that protocol. But then our National Science Foundation saw this as an important trend that should be made more widely available. And they created the NSF Net project to try to get the internet between all of the institutions of higher education, particularly to support research. It turned out that the University of Michigan won the contract to do that. And the uptake of the internet was so rapid and so profound that it tended to almost overnight swamp out all the other proprietary protocols. And industry started seeing this as the way to go, and that the openness of the internet was a much better strategic investment for them than the proprietary networks. So had NSF not done that, and had Michigan not been so successful in propagating that quickly, we could still be speaking multiple protocols, kind of like we do in the cell phone area now. So then NSF, as the power of computers, our National Science Foundation, realized that although the defense community, the Atomic Energy Commission, and other places had the means for supercomputing, much of it used for confidential or secure kinds of work, that the general open research community of the university world did not have the kind of supercomputing that they could take advantage of. So they started a major supercomputer center initiative where they have about 5 or 6 universities that maintain the state-of-the-art, highest-end computer, Cray, Amdahl type machines. And they were expected to allow the general research community, people at other universities, to use those machines and provide service to them. But of course, to have access to those machines, we needed robust networks. And so that was accompanied by increasing the robustness and bandwidth of the network. So NSF played a major role in both providing the high-end computing power and the appropriate high-performance networking to get that center. So that went on for many years, and it, of course, had a profound impact on the ability to model and predict in various ways, and really added a kind of a fourth, what's often called a kind of fourth dimension of how research could be done. The fourth paradigm, yes, that
Jim Gray coined the fourth paradigm, right? So that's what you're referring to, yeah.
Yes, that's right. That we had experimentation and theory and so forth, and now we had this new model of computational inquiry, initially largely based on modeling of phenomena and of course on design. Now, of course, more recently, with the digitization of everything and the enormous power and the AI and machine learning methods we'll get to in a moment, there's also these new methods of extracting knowledge through data mining that is now used extensively for computing.
If I could sort of interrupt you at this point. So
sure.
The key, I would say, thank you for giving us a history of computing in a capsule within a few minutes. So the key drivers, if I may say so, has been the shift from, in one sense, shift from the military, DARPA, or federal government-based support for computing as well as research to then it shifting to academia, and then shifting from computing to networking, and then to use your word, cyber infrastructure, or how it transformed the research methodology from experimental research to data-intensive research. That has been the primary, I would say, the path or the journey of computing for research, right?
That's right, but the story is not over, because
in fact, today I hear people saying that AI is the future of science, right? That is the phrase that some people use. Of course, the people use AI is the future of everything. But since the topic of our discussion today is research and science, etc., so many people have called it as the AI is the future of science or research. So, I mean, taking your conversation or your story forward, the major change that you see from, say, I would say you have come to almost towards the end of the first decade of the 21st century in your journey right now, right? So, what has happened in the last one decade?
Yeah, well, so just let me quickly pick up the story. So we had the supercomputer initiatives for a decade, but then it was noticed that we had this revolution in the digitization of everything. And the fact that all scientific instruments had now become digital and could be used remotely, and the digital library revolution that you're very familiar with, and the digitization of data, and the fact that these instruments now produce things initially, everything was being born digital. Okay, so it was decided that the current supercomputer center, where there was the computer was the center of this initiative, was an inadequate model of the infrastructure, that we needed to start thinking about how we take computing and networking and data repositories and online instruments and real-time collaboration technology where people could work together in real time, as we're doing right now, and bring that all together. And so there was a conference led by Bill Wolf, who was the head of the computing directorate. It was actually sponsored by Josh Lederberg, a Nobel laureate at Rockefeller University in New York. And that workshop, that invitational workshop where I was privileged to be invited, came up with the concept of the science collaboratory. That was a made-up word. It's a laboratory without walls. The idea that you can do scientific research in a distributed fashion. And it was a lot more than video conferencing. It was the idea of having computational tools, collaboration, data, instruments, all available. And as a result, there was a National Academy study that kind of sanctioned that idea. Then there was a major initiative from NSF to support research in actually building collaboratories. We got a decade of research to do that, creating the Space Science Collaboratory, which I don't have time to go into, but it clearly revolutionized the way the field, in that case, that studied the magnetosphere and the upper atmosphere and the solar winds and so forth, started to do their research. In Europe, this was often called e-science. I'm sure there were similar initiatives in India with the various things. So that was the nexus, cyber infrastructure ecologies of computing, data, information, activation, acquisition, distance independent collaboration. So now if you imagine a 2x2 matrix of same and different time and place, you could do knowledge-based work in all four variants of that, and have instruments available to you that you wouldn't otherwise have. So it had a democratization of science. Spin-offs from that, the humanities community have also adopted collaboratories, as well as it's had an effect on project-based education and so forth. So that was the collaboratory movement, was the next big thing, and proceeded. And then more recently, with the increasing incredible power of computing, we've had then the emergence of practical application of machine learning and AI type techniques that, and with our ability to accumulate and to process massive amounts of data and do sophisticated statistics on data. As I said earlier, now we've had the emergence of the ability to extract knowledge from large collections of data where we don't actually know a priori what knowledge resides there. And then that, by the way, has given rise to the need to archive and preserve and curate long-term data, just in case it can get used later on. And it's given a rise to a lot of emphasis on the value, both the current and future value of data collections. As your listeners know, AI and machine learning is being used broadly now in all kinds of things, from much more robust voice recognition and used for good and evil, I would say, in some cases. About 2 years ago, Eric Schmidt, who is, was chairman of the board of Google and a wealthy person, has started his own scientific discovery, Schmidt Sciences, and they went to our National Academy of Sciences and Engineering, which is kind of like the Royal Society in London, and said, we're noticing that AI and machine learning are being used extensively within research, but we're wondering if it could actually be used even more powerfully than it is now. It's being used as components for statistical analysis and so forth. Could we imagine that the AI could be applied to actually designing experiments, to experimental design, and then actually run the experiments in an iterative fashion to speed up actually the conduct of the research itself? Okay, so I was asked to chair a committee of 10 people who were to try to answer that question. And we conducted 2 years ago, just before the COVID shutdown, we conducted a major symposium and involved people internationally, people from Europe and so forth, to get experts to help us answer that question. And then in a fairly tedious COVID era, a 2-year project working primarily in a fashion, we produced that report, which is now undergoing final review. And it will be available in a few months, but I cannot release it at this time, but I can tell you a little bit about what it says if you'd like.
So this committee's focus that you are chairing, the focus has been how to accelerate or improve discovery, right? Scientific discovery, scientific research. What has been the focus? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's so we have these collaboratory environments. We have this powerful computing. Let's now see how AI can be used to further accelerate the conduct of science. So
is it sort of, like, for example, in AI, particularly machine learning, etc., the focus so far was on more on, massive sets of data, and then, as you said, data knowledge discovery through data sets, etc. So it's not about data mining or knowledge discovery, but more about accelerating the experimentation or modeling and those kinds of things. Can you just elaborate on the focus of this particular committee?
Yes, well, the concept of research workflows is not new. That can mean anything: computational pipelines or steering sweeps or guided data explorations, just a methodical way of conducting a research. And then, of course, modifying what you do based on the results in a kind of iterative discussion kind of way. So the question is, how could AI be used to help produce more efficient workflows, and then to actually operate the workflows in a way that would exceed? And acceleration, you're quite right. The key word is acceleration, but it's acceleration in at least 3 senses. One is accelerating in the generation of workflows, acceleration in the exchange and reuse of workflows, and accelerating the workflows themselves, the actual process of discovery. And it's the reason this is a timely topic is because of the increasing power of artificial intelligence, the increasing availability of data, and the emergence of open science, and particularly the openness, the emergence of this so-called FAIR movement, which is being promoted. It's largely the leadership is actually coming from Europe, to make data more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That's what
UNESCO has also approved this open science framework, and all the members of UNESCO have signed this. So probably we can expect a little more, traction at each of the nations and governments to focus more on open science and open data sharing, etc.
Exactly, and that's a critical development for the meaningful use of what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And it's also hope that there are also, as you're aware, there are major challenges in science today in reliable and reproducibility.
Yes.
And the use of AI as components within discovery systems is actually making that more difficult, because people don't actually know what's going on inside of those black boxes, and so the motivation for that study is to observe that there is activity in this direction already. So let's learn from that and see how to generalize it. It's the progress in open science. It's the growing use of contemporary digital lab workbooks and workflows and so forth. It's the challenges we're confronting to reliable and reproducible work. And so I think, so these methods have been used for decades, and some fields, and I'll give some examples in a second, are starting to explore how where you have a model and you have data and you have experimentation producing data, and then data, you learn about the data and come back and change the model. That's the basic model that we're talking about here. And we actually have found places in pharmaceutical and other places that are in fact using that model and achieving thousandfold speed ups in discovery. And I'll give you a couple of examples if you'd like. Let me just pull up something here to some notes. So so in materials research, for example, groups are building systems that a combination of laboratory automation and machine learning that are cutting time requirements for synthesizing and testing new materials from 9 months to 5 days. Very dramatic. In particle physics, new approaches are drawing inferences that can be combined in workflows that implement various inference algorithms. And these approaches show significant possibility of allowing experiments to achieve greater sensitivity with only half the data that they traditionally use. In drug discovery, and this has been going on for several years now, active learning algorithms, in an example we discovered, identified 60% of the active compounds by performing only 2.5% of the possible experiments compared to the manual methods. So that it's a much smarter in kind of defining experiment and then pruning the experiments that lead nowhere, kind of like playing chess, I suppose. And in biochemistry, they're using robots and data science to further automate throughput systems. Astronomers are doing a lot in this area, using machine learning and to increase the fine control of telescopes and automating target selection to get much more effective results from the limited time available on these expensive telescopes. And we were also very pleased to find that it was being used in digital humanities. There's work at King's College on using deep neural networks to tackle complexities of computing information from huge volumes of words and across multiple languages over the centuries to see patterns and how ideas have spread and changed over time, and to actually try to understand the development of human thought over centuries. And it's also being used in the social and behavioral sciences in a variety of ways. So the report, which I think will be available in a few months, will actually talk about those examples and talk not only about the technology requirements, but the educational, how do we support graduate students and professors to actually understand and produce these results? What kind of staffing we will need for research projects that use these methods? And then, as I said before, the kind of ethical reproducibility, replicability, kinds of social and behavioral norms that are involved here. So I think this is the next big thing. And we're optimistic that the various research sponsors like the NSF and so forth will kind of pick up the challenge to make this widespread, as they did many years ago, in just making basic high-end computing available.
Thank you so much for sharing some of these examples from material science to astronomy to chemistry to even drug discovery. In fact, I mean, since we are still kind of hopefully the beginning of the end of the pandemic, even the vaccine or even drug discovery due for the corona virus has been accelerated, has been possible within such a short time, mainly because of all of these developments, that is data sharing, sequence sharing, and all of these efforts that you have been sort of spearheading since the last 25 years or so. So end of the day, we are still, I mean, as you rightly mentioned, the reproducibility, reliability, and robustness of data is the key for the future of science, and AI and other technologies are helping us towards that. But what are the challenges that your committee or you have seen in this, reaching that goal of, open collaboratories for sharing knowledge and work? End of the day, that's collaboration is the key, right? What are the challenges that you see?
Good question. But before I answer, I also want to mention that the capture of metadata and provenance is also an important part of this approach, and we hope that these autonomous or automated research flow works will do a better job of actually capturing and preserving provenance. And the kind of things that you have worked on in your career around data and archiving and metadata and curation and so forth are incredibly critical to this. And so that is, it's one of the big issues that's always the case in these changes along the way is the sustainability of the infrastructure. So, NSF starts these initiatives, makes major investments, but eventually they feel compelled to take that money and turn it over to the next big thing. And so the question is, does the research community, do the universities, the private industry, where does the ongoing sustainable support for this happen? All right. So the finance. The second major barrier, of course, is how do you change the education and experience of the graduate student and the professor and so forth to become aware of these activities. And the third is, of course, the always the tension in the research community between cooperating and keeping things proprietary so that you get the credit for it, and the management of intellectual property and all that kind of thing. And so I'm saying the other question is the various practices of the community and whether people see mutual self-interest in working together. If they don't, then it will not be sustainable. So, for example, in the collaboratory project that I mentioned, the Space Science Collaboratory Project, there were these 5 or 6 ground-based observing stations that would observe solar winds and the interaction with magnetosphere, solar weather, and they all pretty much worked independently. But over time, and they competed with each other for funding and so forth from the same sponsor. But over time, as we provided the opportunity for those instruments and those people to work together and share data and share knowledge and share experiments, they started seeing that with this new integrated kind of worldview that they could get, they could all benefit. They could actually do new science. They could do things. So it's the whole issue of whether you're fighting over the same size pie, or whether you can create, by working together, you can create a larger pie and everyone advantages. So there are different norms, of course, in different fields. Some absolutely require distributed work, others don't. But I think the incentives for sharing, the incentives for letting other people use your data, I think the methods of discovery and so forth that I'm talking about will, over time, create more incentive for people to see that they can all gain by working together. They can tackle grander problems than they could individually. And I think most scientists understand that the grand challenge problems of our world have to be done in a highly collaborative, interdisciplinary, and increasingly international way. I mean, the response and discovery of the corona vaccines, for example, is a good example of that. And the collaboratory type methods, although not using that term, were critical to that rapid development. The huge acceleration in the discovery of effective vaccines over traditional methods.
True that. But I was reading a study about the data sharing of the coronavirus and related research, and then that study, which based on Pub Central data, showed that less than 20% of actually papers, scientific articles written on this subject have shareable data. They have shared the data set. So still a long way when it comes to, as you said, the key is the collaboration, the key is sustainability and the stewardship. Sustainability comes with, the policy, yes, governments, etc. And the second thing is the stewardship. The stewardship rests with, in my view, the scientific community. See, we all have to come to the notion that, we don't own anything. We are just here to, we are custodians to pass it on to the next group or the next generation or the others. So until that mindset sets in, that we are only, I would say we are only taking care of the science or taking care of the data research, etc., until someone else comes along to take it forward. So that stewardship is necessary. So these two, sustainability and stewardship, perhaps, there are many things which are important, are the key to accelerating scientific discovery or accelerating research itself. So to end our interview, I would like you to give us a message for the hope that you have for the future of science and research.
Well, I actually have a lot of faith in the science community to take up and make meaningful use of these tools. People discover it at different times, but when they see their colleagues elsewhere getting competitive advantage out of taking up these new tools, it's also, as you know, often the case that the younger generation, the graduate students and so forth, they become fluent in this and then push the old timers like me into the new field. So I'm optimistic that these developments, and they have in the past, speak for themselves and will be taken up. The question you raised, though, of data stewardship, long-term access to data, and so forth, it is a major barrier. And but we have to start thinking of data as infrastructure,
yes,
right? It's critical to have these data repositories as it is to have the internet and the computing and the so forth. And so we've got to find economic models that will allow this to be done on a sustainable basis. And I'm encouraged there because the National Science Foundation for years was so reluctant to get into the data stewardship area, but have now recently just awarded, I think, $20 million to several places, including the University of Michigan, to start figuring out how to do that. I'll also say that it's not just the responsibility of the federal government or the government of India or so forth. It's the responsibility of all research universities to do their share. Like we have major academic libraries that we put millions of dollars into to preserve knowledge for the future generations. We have to start expanding that into data resources. So it's a collective responsibility, and it is a responsibility. It's definitely a responsibility. So I would just, I guess my parting words would be, as individual scientists and educators, we need to do our part, and the institutions of which we are a part have to do their part. And so I would encourage researchers to step up to leadership in their only particular part of the world and their particular discipline to help discover ways to make meaningful use of this, and that we all have in common this desire to use our talent and knowledge and passion for discovery to make this world better. And we certainly all agree that it needs to be better, right?
It needs to be better.
Meet the grand challenges of our day.
Yeah, do things better. Thank you so much, Dan, for sparing your time and also for your, on that positive, hopeful note, and also thank you for giving that, I would say, clarion call to the academic community to take up the responsibility and be part of that, I would say, becoming part of that infrastructure, both for data, cyber, or what have you, to do things better and do research better so that it impacts society and scholarship. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Bye. Bye.
Bye.